Before we get into this, I want to establish something. I believe that I am a bigger Metallica fan than you are. Now, if you're anything like me, hearing somebody say that probably almost creates this sort of defensive energy in you, like, who's this poser? And if that's the case, you're in the right spot. Welcome. We're going to get along just fine. I've seen one person online who I'm willing to concede may be a bigger Metallica fan than I am, and I will link his channel below. He makes amazing videos about Metallica. I'm not going to disrespect the man by mispronouncing his name because I'm terrible with names, but he's amazing. Absolutely check him out. He's also from Ukraine and obviously going through a bit of a rough time at the moment, so please give the man some love. He's well and truly earned it. But for the sake of this video, let's just work with the idea that at the very least, I like Metallica as much, but probably more than you. Can you defend Saint Anger? Lulu doesn't count. That was a Lou Reed album, not a Metallica album. Alright, let's move on. So when I started putting together this little studio, I decided I wanted to get a bunch of amplifiers that sort of covered as much tonal ground as possible. So one of the first amps that I bought for this studio was the Marshall JVM, and that has 4 different channels, 3 different modes. It will basically do anything Marshall-ish, anything sort of British voiced. To go along with that, I also bought myself a Mesa Mark V, which I think you can see behind me there. And that will cover most things sort of Fender voiced, sort of American voiced. No, those 2 amps won't cover everything, but between the 2, it will cover a fair bit of ground. Now, the hardcore Metallica nerds will probably see where I'm going with this. The Master of Puppets album was famously recorded by slaving a Mesa Mark IIc Plus amplifier into a Marshall JCM 800. Now, the Mesa Mark V has a 2C Plus mode on it, and the JVM is kinda, sorta, but not really, but kinda, sorta based on a Marshall JCM 800. Flemming Rasmussen was also really awesome, and he uploaded the session notes from when he recorded that album, so I was able to understand exactly what techniques he used to record that guitar sound. So if I have the session notes and I have similar amps, why haven't I tried to recreate that Master of Puppets guitar sound? While we're at it, Load is one of Metallica's best albums, and Bob Rock is an absolute genius. Okay, moving on. Some acknowledgements from the hardcore Metallica nerds and also the recording nerds, who at this point in time are probably screaming abuse at me. For the record, I understand, and I would probably be doing the same if I was you, but let's just acknowledge these things first. These 2 amps, while very similar to the original amps, they are not the original amps. There are going to be differences there. I'd like to point out though, in my defense, that in the 1980s, quality control was different. Finding 2 Marshall JCM 800s and 2 Mesa 2C Pluses that sound identical, it's probably going to be a challenge anyway. But at the same point in time, these are different amps, so there's going to be differences. Also, Metallica in their Marshall cab, they were using 65 watt Celestians. I don't have a set of those speakers. I'm using something different, so that's going to create some differences as well. And finally, Flemming Rasmussen had access to microphones that I do not. So I have attempted to mimic his techniques as best as I could with the microphones I had available to me. In other words, where Flemming Rasmussen used a dynamic microphone, I used a dynamic microphone. Where he used a condenser, I used a condenser. But to say that 2 different microphones sound the same, of course they don't. There's going to be differences there. So we can't expect to get identical results, but if I'm following the same recording techniques and I'm using similar amps, I'm hoping to get pretty damn close. I'm hoping, yeah? So let's hear what those guitars sound like soloed just by themselves. Now, no matter what you might think of that recorded noise, in the room, my God, it sounded awesome. Like I was in fanboy heaven. Whatever you think the amps sound like in the room from listening to the original recording, that's basically the noise I had going on in here. I was psyched. I was like, yes, I have definitely positively nailed this. So really excited. I started mixing everything together, and this is the first thing I learned. Flemming worked hard to create that guitar tone, because for each guitar there were 2 cabs and 3 microphones, which means there's 6 tracks to create 1 guitar track. When I started mixing all that together, that was actually legitimately a pain in the neck to balance 6 different microphones in order to create 1 guitar track. So, I mean, Flemming, if for nothing else for doing that, he's a genius. But, so I mixed it all together and I was really excited with the results. I was like, yes, I've nailed this. So then I got brave and I thought what I should do with all my confidence and excitement, I thought I would compare my recording to the original recording and see how close they were, right? And I sat back, all smug, being like, yeah, I've nailed this. So here's my guitars, and then compared to the original recording. The original recording, this was ripped, I believe, from Guitar Hero. Do you guys remember Guitar Hero? How awesome was Guitar Hero? Anyways. So here's my guitars played next to the original guitars recorded by Flemming, Rasmussen and James Hetfield. Yeah, that one hurt. I gotta admit that one took me down a peg. Look, don't get me wrong, I am thrilled with the guitar noise I managed to create. I think my guitars sound fantastic. But do they sound anything like the original guitars? Not really. I mean, they're close. You can sort of tell that it's got the same vibe, but it definitely doesn't really sound the same overall. So feeling disappointed, I decided to cheat. And with modern technology, that's really easy these days. Fabfilter EQ has this feature called Match EQ, whereby you can give it a reference track, and then whatever track you apply that reference track to, it will create an EQ curve to make sure that the timbre of the 2 tracks is basically identical. Now, it's not really meant to be used like this. The way that Fabfilter, I believe, intend this to be used is more like, okay, you've recorded something on 2 separate days and for some reason you got 2 slightly different results. So like, I don't know, if it was guitar, maybe the microphone was bumped, or the strings are slightly more dead, or the tube amp wasn't firing on all cylinders that day. It's meant to fix, balance out slight differences, not completely change a guitar sound as I'm doing here. But look, I wanted the Master of Puppets guitar sound, so I cheated, and this is the end result. I'm going to play my cheat guitars versus the James Hetfield original. Now that's what I was expecting to hear. It's still not identical. There are still some big differences there. I think the biggest difference here that I'm going to have to painfully admit is the performance. It hurts me to say that despite my years of adoration and trying to sound like James Hetfield, I unfortunately still do not play guitar like James Hetfield. I don't think anybody does, but yeah, so a big difference here is performance, but in terms of like tonality and timbre, I was pretty excited with what I had. So obviously the next step is to drop the cheek guitars into my mix, so that way I have the James Hetfield tone in my mix, and I was like, yeah, this is gonna sound amazing, awesome. So that's what I did. So what you're gonna hear now is you're gonna hear a side-by-side comparison. You're going to hear my mix with the cheek guitars, and then you're gonna hear my mix with my original guitars, and you'll hear how they sound side by side. Yeah, it didn't quite work as well, did it? Now, one thing I want to clarify just in case anybody wants to jump on this. I am not saying that my mix sounds better than the original. Absolutely not. Nowhere in a million years. Master of Puppets stands alone. That is an amazing sounding album and nobody will get close. And that's kind of the point of the video. I'm just getting there in a roundabout way because that's how I do things. Welcome. But the cheek guitars sound worse in my mix compared to how my guitars sound in my mix. And I think there's a really interesting lesson to be learned there. While my mix might now have like the James Hetfield guitar tone, it doesn't have Cliff Burton playing on bass behind it. It's got me playing bass behind it. And look, I mean, I'm nowhere near as good of a guitar player as James Hetfield, but I don't come close to the late great Cliff Burton on bass guitar. So it's my bass tone underneath James Hetfield's guitar tone. On top of that, I don't have Lars Ulrich playing drums in here. It's a completely different drum sound. So the reason why the cheek guitars sound worse in my mix is because they're working in a completely different context. And context is everything. While we're at it, And Justice for All is Metallica's best album. Fight me, bass players. Except Jason Newsted. Newsted is Metallica's most underrated member. He gave absolutely everything he had to that band and he doesn't get enough credit for it. Alright, moving on. Sometimes an absolutely amazing sound that you idolize and you try to recreate as close as possible, sometimes that noise will only work in that specific context. And when you take that noise out of that context and put it in a completely different context, it just doesn't work. And that's such a useful thing to be aware of. So this is a really important thing for tone chasers to be aware of, and I'm saying this as an incredibly guilty tone chaser myself. In fact, full confession, my pedal collection could basically be summarized as David Gilmour played one, therefore I had to have one, and so magically I ended up with a lot less money. Yeah, right? I'm sure I'm not the only person saying that, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. But the thing is even if you manage to identically recreate that guitar sound that you absolutely worship, there's a very good chance that that guitar sound isn't going to necessarily work in the context that you're currently working in. Maybe the entire reason why that guitar sounds so amazing isn't because the guitar sounds amazing, but it's just because of the context it exists in. So if you're in a band and you're working your hardest to get Adam Jones's guitar sound from Tool and like trying to nail that perfectly, I mean, great, go for it. It's a lot of fun and it can be really rewarding, speaking as someone guilty of that myself. But the thing is that sound might not actually work unless your bass player is trying to sound like Justin Chancellor. And if he is, good luck with your projects. By the way, that isolated guitar track by Hetfield, that was like 8 guitars layered on top of one, whereas my performance was just 2. He managed to get a sound that tight with like 4 times the amount of guitars. The man is a god. Okay, moving on. So what we should focus on instead is trying to capture the vibe.
It's the vibe of it.
Wear your influences on your sleeve. Make sure that when you hear you play, you can hear all of your guitar heroes and everybody else that you idolize, because that's a really rewarding thing to hear. But breaking your bank account and your sanity, going to like the finest of details, trying to recreate somebody else's guitar sound, it's folly. It's not going to end up with the results that you hope to achieve. You should instead focus on creating your own sounds, and those sounds should grow from the context that you're working with. But that doesn't just apply to tone chasers out there, that should also apply to mixers as well. Rather than trying to create a mix that sounds exactly like Jens Bogren, you should probably instead work on creating a mix that sounds like you instead. And I know that this has been a topic that has been bashed to death constantly over the internet, but I think that this recording here that I accidentally did, I think it's a really, really good example of it. If you create sounds and mixes out of the context that you work in, that's probably going to end up with a much better sound than if you just focused entirely on copying somebody else. That being said, if anyone has a high-watt DR103 that Gilmour used to play, I mean, I wouldn't say no. I mean, they look like fun. Look, I just want to play comfortably numb, all right? Just besides, how cool is it that some things are genuinely impossible to recreate? I mean, it'd be pretty boring if we could all rush out and go buy a Mesa 2C Plus, plug into it and sound exactly like James Hetfield. That would mean Master of Puppets would be that little bit less special. I mean, one of the reasons why Master of Puppets is held to the pinnacle that it is because there genuinely aren't any metal albums that sound like Master of Puppets, that don't have that same vibe.
Just the vibe of the thing.
As Master of Puppets. And that's awesome. That's what makes Master of Puppets special. How much does it suck when something new and exciting and kind of mind-blowing comes out that just rocks your world, and then 3 years later there's about 12 other bands who are all trying to sound exactly the same as Meshuggah, but not quite doing it as well as Meshuggah. So if you do end up going down that tonal rabbit hole, trying to recreate that exact same sound that you hear in a recording, which is still a lot of fun to do, instead of finding yourself frustrated and, cheating to make sure that you get that result, instead we should probably not hate ourselves for it, and instead regard it as an indication for how special that original recording actually is. If you liked the video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I would be happy to rant at you again sometime in the future. If you like the noises that I make, regardless of whether or not I'm cheating or not, please feel free to email me below and we'll see what we can work out. Thank you very much for your time. Now go play some music.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe. I rest my case.
That was sensational.